Here we have the website. I mention this periodically. I have now put up all the notes for the study of Ruth. And when I say notes, I don't know if you've ever gone there. They're in outline form, but they're essentially manuscripts. It's not like you just have a line, a bullet point. It has citations to all the things I give you, all, the full citations to all the quotes that I provide and all that. If you haven't gone there, there's probably 1,700 pages of material there on many, many different subjects. But all of the books that I teach, when I'm finished, I put all the notes up there. So you can go through and read the notes at your leisure. And then my email address is right there. You're always free to email me with anything about what I'm talking about, any study that I've done, anything you want to talk about. I'll do my best to take a whack at what you're asking, so feel free to do that. I assume you all know that. Okay? I mean, that just goes without saying. I put this up here. My email address is available elsewhere. So if you have questions, you can study through the material there. You can email me, and I'll give it my best shot. All right, Ruth, I'm going to try to finish today. I think I can do it. But I always like to do this. I like to reset where we are. And I do it because it reinforces what we've talked about, but it also brings you back because I know what it is to sit in classes. And if I ask you what I was talking about last week, 95% of you would have no idea. That's just the way it is. Ken had that statistic. Once I forget, it was frightening, though. So I try to back up, and by the time I do all that, we've reinforced these things quite a few times. All right, in chapter 3, you remember that Ruth, she carries out Naomi's plan to encourage Boaz to assume what Naomi perceives to be Boaz's responsibility as the kinsman redeemer. So Ruth carries that out. She meets with Boaz privately on the threshing floor in the dead of the night, and she asks him to marry her in his capacity as kinsman redeemer. Now, the tension at this point in the story, as I've said, at least as I see it, the tension is whether Boaz will embrace Naomi's perspective on the kinsman redeemer's duty. And so, her view is that, look, the kinsman redeemer buys back property that a member of the clan has sold to somebody outside the property, has that responsibility, but also has the responsibility of marrying the deceased person's widow and raising children by that person, having children by that person, so as to continue the dead person's lineage in association with that property. Now beyond, so you have a fusion. It's kind of like levirate marriage extended beyond brothers. So you have this notion tied in with the kinsman redeemer's duty to redeem property. Those two fuse that you don't see elsewhere. But you see those two fuse, and beyond that, there's another wrinkle where the widow is alive but beyond childbearing age, that you then have a responsibility to substitute the widowed daughter-in-law for the widow who's alive but beyond childbearing. All right, so you see that this is an atypical situation. I think that Naomi is saying, listen, I think this is the correct extension of the clan guardian principle that is part of the kinsman redeemer's duty. That's what a kinsman redeemer is. He's a guardian of the clan. This is an extension. So the tension I see here is, will Boaz embrace that? And Boaz, of course, he reacts very positively to that proposal, and he tells Ruth not to fear, that he'll do all that she's asked. But then in chapter 3, verse 12, he mentions a very large fly in the ointment. He says, I'm all for this. I accept this concept of the responsibility. I think that's right. That is a proper construction of a kinsman redeemer's duties. I'm all for it. I will do all that you ask. But there's somebody closer than I am. And so none of this works unless we deal with that person. He's not going to outflank him. He says there's somebody closer than I am, so we have to deal with that. There's somebody who has the prior duty. So he tells Ruth that he'll bring the matter of her redemption to a resolution in the morning, and he assures her that he'll redeem her if the prior kinsman redeemer won't do it. So he basically pledges to her that he's going to do that. Now, after Ruth reports to Naomi, you remember the scene then shifts to the city gate where Boaz, he convenes a legal assembly for business. So he goes and he gets the 10 elders, and he gets the person who the convening of this assembly is made easier by the fact this fellow just happens to walk by. The nearer redeemer happens to walk by. He convenes this assembly at the city gate, which is where they would do business, for this transaction that he has in mind. Now we then learn that Naomi has some kind of interest in Elimelech's field. Okay, she has some kind of interest in his field, and that interest, obviously, it's of no practical value to her in alleviating her difficult circumstances. That's why she's scavenging for food through Ruth. She's out gleaning. She's trying to find food. She's in dire circumstances. That's the whole setup of the story. She has nobody. And so she has some kind of interest, but that interest is of no practical value to her. But what is the nature of that interest? She has an interest. It's of no practical value in alleviating her difficult circumstances. What's the nature of the interest? And we're trying to go back 3,000 years and figure out some intricacies of Jewish family law and custom, so it's not that easy to get a grip on it. Now, what seems likely to me is that prior to moving to Moab, Elimelech had sold out of economic necessity. He'd sold to somebody outside the clan the right to possess and use the field until Jubilee. You can't sell it outright. You know that, right? You can only sell the right to use and possess it because in the 50th year, Jubilee, it comes back to the clan. So now, by the way, with regard to Malta's question last week, what's up with these every 7 years? Every 7th year was a Sabbath year of rest for the land. That's what it was. So the land was to lie fallow every 7th year. There was no organized farming, sowing, pruning, or reaping. And so that's every 7th year is a Sabbath year of rest for the land. After 7 of those, the 50th year, that's Jubilee, and that's when the property that was sold has to come back. Okay, so I think that's what makes the most sense is that Elimelech, prior to going to Moab, he out of economic necessity has sold the right to use and possess the land until Jubilee to somebody outside of the clan. Okay, then Naomi, as Elimelech's widow, she apparently inherited on his death a right to possess and use the field until she remarried or died. Now this, you just have to say, where do you see all that? You're just trying to put pieces together to make sense of the story. Okay, and that looks like that's how, what is at play here is that she apparently inherited on his death a right to possess and use the land until she remarried or died. But since that right had already been sold, that's what Elimelech had sold, the right to possess and use the property until Jubilee. It was gone. So for her to realize that right that she had as a widow, she would have to buy out the person to whom Elimelech had sold it, because he's sitting there on it. He's got the right to it until Jubilee. So if she wants to have the right to possess, she's going to have to buy him out. But she has no money. Okay, she's penniless. So it means nothing to her. That's why this right that she has in the field does nothing to alleviate her difficult circumstance, because she can't buy it. She can't do anything. So what's she going to do? She's going to transfer it, okay? She's been reduced to scavenging for food. She can only realize this right and take possession of it by transferring her right to redeem as a widow, by transferring that right to redeem as a widow to the kinsman redeemer, who would then be obligated to go and buy it from this third person and bring it back for the benefit of the family. So what I think is going on is she is transferring her position as the widow. She can't use this, so she's saying, okay, I'm transferring this to the nearest kinsman redeemer, and when he takes it, he then must go out and buy this property back for the benefit of the family. Right, that's what I think is going on. Now, Boaz announces to the nearer redeemer that Naomi is transferring or disposing of her widow's right. Okay, her widow's right to buy back the field from the current possessor. She's passing her right of redemption to Elimelech's nearest kinsman, the nearest kinsman redeemer, which he has to either then exercise or pass it on to the next person in line, which is Boaz. All right, so she says, look, I have this right as a widow. It's worthless to me. I'm passing it on. Somebody pick up the baton and go and redeem this property for the benefit of my family. I'm passing it on. Now, Boaz says to the near guy, you're going to do it? You're going to take it because I'm sitting right behind you, and if you're not, I'm going to do it. So this is a situation now. He tells this person, you tell me whether or not you're going to function this way as the redeemer of the property. And as I said last week, the actual redemption of the property from the third person, that's not what's reported. That takes place off stage. You don't see a negotiation. So it is the right here of redemption that's being dealt with. All right, now we're ready to finish the book. All right, let me read 4:3-8. We looked at this last week, but I want to read it again, pick back up, and I think we can make it. It says in chapter 4, verse 3, it says, then he said to the redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel. I went through selling, means transferring her right or her interest, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it. But if you will not tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Okay, there's a lot of things going on here. The near Redeemer, he says, okay, I'm in. He says, tell me if you're going to redeem it. He says, okay, I'm going to assume Naomi's right to do this, which carries with it the obligation for me to then go to this third person and say, I'm redeeming this property back for the benefit of Naomi's family. So he says, yeah, I'm going to go ahead. I'm willing to do that. And then Boaz tells him in verse 5 that doing that, well, he says that, that carries the obligation of marrying Ruth in order to have children by her, so as to perpetuate Elimelech's name on the family land, to perpetuate his lineage and association. All right, we're all agreed that's part of it. And what I like here is that Boaz presents just as a legal fact. What I suspect is at least a debatable question here about the kinsman redeemer's duty. There's this broad view, but he simply states it as fact. You know that when you do this, that involves also taking Ruth and having children by her. You know that, right? And so the person says, okay, he agrees to that. You see, and I think it's very important here, putting it that way. She's simply saying that, look, this is the way the law is. This is the duty. This is the definition of the kinsman redeemer's responsibility. When you say yes to this, you're saying yes to taking Ruth and raising children by her. It's just that the social dynamic of this, I find, is very interesting. Because he has just made it very, very difficult for the other kinsman redeemer to object to that broad view, even if he wanted to. You see, because, the idea, it's an honor and shame culture. As you say, like in China, like this guy would lose face. If he wound up saying at that point, whoa, you must be crazy. Because obviously Boaz says that I'm willing to do that. You see, he's saying, that's part of it, right? Okay, so now the guy's saying, now, if he wanted to and he says, no, I'm not going to do that. What are you, nuts? That's going to be difficult on me to be doing that. I'm not going to be doing that. Well, then how does he look? He looks ungracious. He looks small. He looks like a cheapskate. Okay, so I think just the social part of it here is really interesting to me. So he's kind of pressured into saying, yes, I accept that as the duty, even if he wanted to object to it. Now, this broad view, at least the way I'm conceiving this broad view of the kinsman redeemer's duty, it obviously had a sufficient enough legal basis that even though it may have been debatable, the other redeemer's acquiescence in it, that removed it as an issue for the elders to decide. We're all agreed. You see, we're all agreed that that's the proper construction of the kinsman redeemer's duty. His duty as the guardian of the clan, that is a good understanding of that. So since we're all agreed on that, okay, there's no issue about it. So here we have this fella. His point then, all he can do, he can either say, listen, he can either embrace that duty that he's now acknowledged as a correct understanding of it, or he can reject that duty. That's where he winds up. Now what happens is, the other kinsman redeemer, okay, he declines to assume the responsibility as articulated by Boaz. When Boaz says, this of course goes along with it, he doesn't say, well, that's crazy, I'm not going to. He says, okay, that does, all right, then I can't do it. That goes along with it, I can't do it. And he says, see, that this public stipulation, this public announcement, everybody knows this is what it involves. And that public stipulation, that changed the equation. You can see that's what's at play here. Because he says, I'll do it. And then he says, by the way, yeah, that involves getting Ruth, right? Just remind you of that. Then the guy says, well, I can't do it. Well, what's going on with that? You see, now what I think is going on is that public stipulation that it involved marrying Ruth, it changed the equation because she's young enough to bear children. You see, and that has significance here. Without any descendants from Elimelech, the transaction's really financially easy on the Redeemer. Because the amount that he has to spend to buy back the property, the value of that right to use and possess until Jubilee, the amount he has to spend to buy that back into the family and to care for Naomi would be offset by what he could get from the field. Because he's now going to be there and he's going to get the produce and the property and the income from the field. And in the end, the property would come to him as part of his estate because he is Elimelech's nearest relative, hence the kinsman redeemer. That's why he is the kinsman redeemer. So it would be easy on him because he would buy this back. He would have the income from that field to help offset the expenses, the new expense he has of caring for the widow. And he would have that. And then at the end, the property's his. But now what happens? Now if he has a child through Ruth, Elimelech now has a descendant. Okay, so that child would then inherit the property, presumably at adulthood. So now the property won't come to his estate. It will go to the child. Well, that changes the equation now. So maybe there won't be enough time for him to recoup what it takes to buy this property and the expenses of caring for the widow. Maybe he now won't have time to recoup all of that, and he gets nothing at the end because it doesn't come into his estate. So it may be under those circumstances, what? A net drain for him. You see, and that's what I think he means. He says, I cannot redeem it lest I impair my own inheritance. What do you mean? It's going to drain my assets. So I think that's what's going on. When you see this and he says, well, in that case, I can't do it. I can't do it under those circumstances. Now, Boaz's, his announced desire to assume and to carry out the right of redemption, I think this makes it easier for this fella to turn this down. Okay, I think there's something going on, another psychological, social angle here that makes it easy for him to decline this right of redemption. You see, his doing so under those circumstances isn't going to leave anybody out in the cold. Because Boaz is sitting here right behind him, basically panting, saying, I want to do it. I want to do it. I want to marry. I want to do the whole thing. I want to take care of her. So it's not like when he declines, everybody's going to go, what a jerk you are. Look what happened to you. You left this poor person out. No, that's not going to be the case. And so beyond that, he also has this idea where he can spin his thing where he says, look, okay, in that case, I can't really afford it because it may be a net drain on my stuff and I just don't have that much money and I can't afford that. He can even spin that later, okay? He can spin that to say, well, you know, look, really, it was obvious that Boaz wanted to do this. And I was just really trying to open the door for Boaz in a way that he didn't owe me anything. You see the psychology, and so I can see how this is just so beautifully constructed that he winds up saying, first he says, yeah, that's right, that's the duty carries that. And then he's willing to say, okay, well, I won't do it. Because it's easy to say that because everybody sees that Boaz is eager to do it and he can put himself in a position of, you know, I'm really quite a guy because I just concocted that thing about financial problems so Boaz wouldn't feel bad that I had basically deferred to him. He doesn't owe me anything because the way I've cast it is I really couldn't do it. Now, I don't think that's really how the narrator sees what he's doing. I'm just saying that I can see how that would make it easier for him to decline. Okay, these kinds of things interest me. All right. Now, the relinquishment by the near redeemer of the right and obligation to redeem Elimelech's field and to marry Ruth, that was accomplished by him telling Boaz to acquire the right yourself and removing his sandal and giving it to Boaz. We say that seems odd. Somebody's telling me last week that it's really not odd. There are parallels in modern real estate transfers that, you have these same kinds of, analogous kinds of things. But that's how they did it. Now when they did it back then, when the story happened, we were far enough removed from that custom that they had to accept because they were no longer doing it. They did it then, but they're saying that's how they used to do it, back in those days. Now let me read to you a comment from Daniel Block. He says, the court proceedings were not about redeeming land, but transferring the right to redeem it. I've mentioned that. In footnote 47, he says, as in verse 4, in verse 9 and 10, the verb kana does not mean to buy, but to acquire. In other words, it's the same idea. I think you can get misled with buying and selling, because we think of ownership and that kind of thing. I think it's the idea of transferring this right. Through this action, Boaz's status is changed from being a Goel to being the Goel, Hagoel. He's now the front line. He's a kinsman redeemer. He's close enough for that title to apply, but there's another guy right in front. Well, now he steps up. He's the man now. See, he's first in line. All right. The actual redemption of the land still lay in the future and would involve negotiation between Boaz and the person who currently held Elimelech's estate. So see, when Boaz assumes this responsibility, he's then going to go to this guy, and they're going to haggle. They're going to say, the guy said, this is great land. I got a lot of stuff. Okay, but he's going to, whatever it takes, he's going to come to an agreement, and he's going to buy that back. All right, now, verses now 4, 9, and 10. 4, 9 through 12. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Then all the people who were at the gates and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So here we have Boaz. He calls on the elders and the people who are all gathered at the gate. He's got this legal assembly together. He calls for them at the gate to witness this symbolic act of transfer, which presumably that's what makes it legal. The person goes through this stuff. He says, okay, I can't do it. I'm not doing it. Takes the sandal off, gives him. He says, you guys all saw that. And everybody says, we saw it. And he says, okay, now it's legal. It's done. I am the guy, and I'm going to have to go redeem this, and we'll go through all those things. So he calls on them to be witnesses, and they confirm that role, and then they pronounce a blessing on Boaz. So they do that. Then they pray that Ruth may be as fertile as Rachel and Leah, and that Boaz may prosper in Ephrathah, that he might prosper there and be renowned in Bethlehem, and that Boaz's family line, that it would have a prominence like the line of Perez. Now, Perez's line was particularly prominent. It had given rise to a number of clans in Judah, including Boaz's clan living in Bethlehem. So that's a natural thing for them to say. Basically, they're saying, look, may all these good things come to you. May your line be prominent. May great things happen. It's like typical wedding stuff. Everybody's saying, listen, they're praying that we want this to be a great thing, and may all of these blessings and benefits come your way. Now, notice the recognition here, that the offspring of Boaz's union with Ruth will not only belong to Naomi, as you'll see in verse 17, not only belong to Naomi, but also is going to belong, not only to Naomi, but belong to Naomi and therefore continue Elimelech's line, right? Not only is that going to be true, but also will in some genuine sense belong to Boaz. Right? You see both things going on here. The child is reckoned as being in the lineage of both Elimelech, right? Here's Naomi, the widow, and he's going to marry, he's going to continue Elimelech's line, so the child is in some sense is Elimelech's descendant. But there's another sense in which the child is Boaz's descendant. Okay, because you can see this. You see, being in the line of both Elimelech, you see that in chapter 4, verse 5, 4, verse 10, 4, verses 14 to 7. But also being in the line of Boaz. That's in 4:12 and 4:17 to 22. Now, presumably, in the line of these two different men, for different purposes, okay, different reasons, but the exact, what are those different purposes? What are those different circumstances? Again, hard to get a grip on. It seems clear that the child is a descendant of both, presumably for different circumstances, for different purposes, but exactly the details of those senses and purposes is hard to reconstruct. But you see the same kind of thing, the same phenomenon is evident in Genesis chapter 38, which implicitly reckons Tamar's twins to her first husband, right? That's those. He's going to have. You have to continue the line. I need to have children, and so you see him implicitly reckoned as descendants. While all the Old Testament genealogies in Matthew chapter 1 verse 3, they list them as Judah's sons. Okay, see, it's not unprecedented, but you see this idea that apparently these Levirate-like things, that the person is a descendant of the one person for some purposes and a descendant of the other person for other purposes. Okay, and we say, well, what is that going on? I'd like to have that. Well, maybe 3,000 years ago, we could take a law class and figure out exactly. But as best I can, put it together, that's the way it looks. Now, here we have in verses 13 to 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, Boaz and Ruth, they marry, and the Lord grants Ruth conception or pregnancy, and she gives birth to a son. Now, here we have the Lord specifically said to be intervening here. You see, the Lord grants her conception, grants her pregnancy, and she gives birth to a son. Now, you recall that she'd not had a child during her marriage to Mahlon, which, probably was 10 years. There's some debate about how you read that, if you remember, but probably 10 years and hadn't had any children. She gets married here, and the Lord grants her a child, grants her a son right away. Now, God begins to fulfill the prayer of the witnesses that we just read in verses 11 and 12. Right? What are they praying? May she be fruitful. May your name be renowned. May this be great and everything good. He starts. You see, he starts to fulfill that prayer. He blesses Ruth with a son, and this son will indeed be significant in Israel. More significant than the author of Ruth understood. Okay? But significant. Understood writing post-David understood that this child is more significant than they knew. But now we're standing over here and we go, boy, you're not kidding. You're not kidding. This child is indeed significant. Now the women of Bethlehem, they praise God for his kindness toward Naomi. Do you see the switch now? What has happened in the early chapters? Naomi's here. It's horrible. And what are they saying now? Praising God for what? His kindness to Naomi. There's a message here. There's a message in this story of God reversing this emptiness and bitterness. God working when you don't really perceive it. God staying with her. And then you see the turnaround. And you have them now exclaiming it and praising God for that. They exclaim that He's not left her without a Redeemer. Okay? Here when they say without a Redeemer, meaning that in the birth of this child, God has given Naomi someone who will provide security for her. See, somebody who in the words of verse 15, will be a restorer of life and a nourisher of her old age. See, I mean, that like I said, there aren't social security plans and all this stuff. She has nobody, and God has given her what is a son, in effect. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And now it says this child then is going to be for her, going to be her source of security. He's going to be the nourisher of life and the nourisher, or the one who restorer of life and a nourisher of her old age. In other words, the Redeemer. When he says here in verse 14, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a Redeemer," he's using Redeemer there in a non-technical sense of the person who is going to be the one who is a restorer of life and a nourisher of her old age. He's not using Redeemer there in the technical legal sense that it's been used earlier of this person who is now in this position and has certain duties and responsibilities. He's referring to the child as a Redeemer in a non-technical sense. Okay, this child is going to be her source of blessing. This child will care for her. This child will be a nourisher in her old age, so she's not alone. Someone is going to be looking out for her. Someone's going to be sure she's fed. She's got what she needs. This child is going to be that person. Now, can you see in a world like that, where people you're out on your own, you have no connections, you're just begging. You're just begging. God has given her someone who's going to do this for her. Now, the women say in verse 15 that this son shall be a restorer of life and a nourisher of her old age, because this child is going to act in this capacity and be this for Naomi, because for her daughter-in-law who loves her, who is more to her than 7 sons, because she's the one who gave birth to this child. That's why the child is going to be this to Naomi. It is because Ruth, who loves her to death and is more to her than 7 sons. What do you mean? Because she cares for Naomi and will take care of her more than 7 sons would. She would look out for Naomi, protect Naomi, give to Naomi, support Naomi. You see, and so she's that blessing. So he says, listen, this child is going to be the nourisher of her old age because she is the son of Ruth, who loves you so much, who's so much that she's worth more to you than 7 sons. The child wouldn't necessarily be the kind of caretaker of Naomi that they envision had he been born to someone not as committed to Naomi's welfare as is Ruth. It is because the child is Ruth's that he is going to be the kind of caretaker for Ruth that they envision. But because this child, the child's mother is Ruth, and Ruth's commitment to her welfare, you know how great that is. That's what so much in the story. The child's mother, because Ruth is the child's mother, and because Ruth's commitment to Naomi's welfare is such that she's a greater blessing than would be 7 sons, the child then is what? The child is going to be taught likewise to love Naomi, and thus will be a blessing, a comfort, and a provider in her old age. What do you think Ruth is going to transmit to this son? Ruth, who has spent her life for Naomi. Ruth, who said, listen, if anything but death separate me from you. Ruth, who traveled with her. Ruth, who says, yes, I'll go ahead and for the sake of the family, I'll marry Boaz. Ruth, whose only thing, she says, listen, it's about you and supporting you and blessing you. What do you think this son's going to be? How do you think she's going to teach this son to view Naomi? So you see, the child, it is because the child has been born to one who is worth more to you than 7 sons, who has a greater commitment to your welfare. You could take 7 dudes, and they say, yeah, I'll stop by and see, I'll do this, I'll do that. This woman is all about blessing you, and she's going to transmit that to this son. Okay, so I think that's what's being said. Ruth's intention in that regard, it's reflected in verse 16, which says that the once empty Naomi, laid the child in her bosom, which the ESV and some others, they say lap, because they're trying to get you to avoid thinking that somehow she's a nurse, literal nurse. Okay, Naomi lays the child in her bosom, meaning she held her to her chest in a fond embrace. Okay, this is what's going on. She holds her to her chest in a fond embrace. She does that and became his nurse, meaning his caregiver or his nanny. You see what's happening here is that Ruth is giving this child to Naomi as a de facto son. She is going to allow Naomi to have a relationship with this son that not all daughters-in-law would. She's going to say, listen, I'm giving this child to you to have this relationship of a nanny, a caretaker, a nurse. You're going to have a relationship with this child different than simply a grandmother. You're going to have something special with this child, and it's reflected right there where she gives this child to her and says that she's going to be her nurse. Bush says, Hence, it's quite clear that the word is used to mean nurse in a sense that the one who takes care of or looks after a child. That's why the New English translation translates it caregiver. The NIV and the TNIV say cared for him. It has nothing to do with, wet nursing or any of that stuff. You might be scratching your head going, how does that work? Okay, you see, it's just that she is giving this child to Naomi in a special relationship where she's going to be the caregiver of this child. So Ruth, she shares her son with Naomi in ways that other daughters-in-law wouldn't, so as to build within that child the kind of commitment for Naomi that Ruth has. You see? So you say, look at how she's committed to Naomi. What would you expect her to do? She's going to engender in that child the same. She's starting to do it. How is she doing it? She's giving the son to Naomi she's going to be the son's caretaker. Nanny is how we would do it. Okay? So what is she doing? She's going to build that bond so that son will in fact grow with that sense of commitment to Naomi's welfare and will be the one who is going to be a blessing in her old age. Will do for her, care for her, look out for her, and have her in his mind. As I say, put yourself in the circumstance of this society. It's hard for us to relate to how significant that is. But the difference between being alone and having a champion, having somebody who says, I'm caring for you. Don't you worry. I will look out for everything you need. When you're getting old, can't get around, hard to scavenge. Okay? This is a very significant thing. Now, given that special caretaker relationship that Naomi was to have with the child, the women exclaimed, a son has been born to Naomi. You see, a son, meaning that one's been born who will be a de facto son to Naomi. A son's been born to, not a grandson, a son's been born to Naomi. And more to it than simply saying, listen, that somebody who is distantly related. It is this idea that we have this special relationship that Ruth is going to give and build between these two, and says a son has been born to Naomi, and accordingly they named the child Obed. And you say, what in the world is that about? Well, here's what Daniel Block says about Obed, the name Obed, okay? Obed, one who serves, is a hypochoristic. Just don't worry about that. It means abbreviated version, you see. Obed, one who serves, is a hypochoristic, an abbreviated version of Obadiah, servant of Yahweh, or Abdiel, a servant of God. By dropping the appellation for God, the little name for God, however, this name is rendered ambiguous. Is the boy viewed as a servant of God or as a servant of Naomi? If the former applies, in other words, if the name means servant of God, then he represents an agent of God born to Naomi to take away the bitterness she accuses God of having imposed on her in chapter 1, verse 20 and 21, and to redeem the estate of her husband. If the latter applies, a servant of Naomi, then his service to Naomi must be more direct. This son is her redeemer, the one who has come to serve her by restoring her life and offering her security in her old age. So this is the idea when it says they named him Obed. Well, they named him Obed because they sit here and they say, listen, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed, you see. That's why they named him Obed after that exclamation. Those two are connected. Somebody who has come is going to serve. Now, the women neighbors, they probably named the child in the sense, you say, well, this seems odd, doesn't it, that you have neighbors who are naming the child? And that does seem odd in any culture, you see. And what's probably going on here is that they named the child in the sense that their exclamation, a son has been born to Naomi, that was the basis of the name that was formally given by the parents. Okay, I think that's what's going on here. They named him, they did it indirectly by giving the exclamation of the truth that is captured in the name that was given by the parents. Here's what Frederick Bush says. He says, what he means by his blatant statement, they, feminine plural, named him, so utterly in conflict with the fact known to all that the parents, usually the mother, named the child, is that these women named him by providing the explanation for his name with their glad cry, a son is born to Naomi. An analogous situation is provided by the naming of Perez in Genesis 38:27 to 29. There, as the infant is born, the midwife exclaims, "What a breach you have made!" And the narrator then relates that the child was named Perez, breach. If it had been literally appropriate in this setting, the narrator could just as well have said, the midwife gave him a name, saying, "What a breach you have made." For it is this statement that provides the explanation for the name. I think that's what's going on. Okay, I think they named him in that sense. Now, the last statement before the formal genealogy is that Obed was the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of David. And here's what Daniel Block says about that. Now, let me say, when I put these things up, I say this periodically. I could take what this person says and I could repeat it. Okay? I would still have to tell you that I got it from Daniel Block. Right? I'm not going to take Block's idea and palm it off as my own. What I'd rather do is when I find somebody who says something in a way I like, I just give it to you. Okay? So if you don't like it, just think of me saying it. All right? So here's Block. He says, the story of Ruth ends on a surprising but climactic interpretive note. In the mind of the narrator, the historical significance of the birth of Obed does not lie in the resolution he brings to the personal crises of the characters in this book. Nor does he derive his significance from valorous deeds either of mercy or power. Neither the present narrator nor any other Old Testament author writes any stories about him. On the contrary, the birth of Obed has historical significance because he lives on and achieves his significance through the lives of his son Jesse and particularly his grandson David. Through David, the blessing of the male witnesses to the court proceedings in 4:11 is fulfilled. Boaz's name is called out in Bethlehem, and through David, the prayer of the female witnesses to the birth of Obed is fulfilled. Obed's name is called out in Israel. Indeed, to this day, their names and the names of Naomi and Ruth are called out all over the world as this story is read. In the providence of God, the genuine piety of all the major characters is rewarded, and the divine plan for Israel and her kings is fulfilled. 18 to 22, final section, the formal genealogy. It says, now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Okay, let me end the study. I'm going to give you a lengthy quote from another one from Daniel Block because I like it. All right. It says, this book and this genealogy demonstrate that in the dark days of the judges, the chosen line is preserved not by heroic exploits, by deliverers or kings, but by the good hand of God, who rewards good people with a fullness beyond all imagination. These characters could not know what long-range fruit their compassionate and loyal conduct toward each other would bear. But the narrator knows. With this genealogy, he declares the faithfulness of God in preserving the family that would bear the royal seed in troubled times and in rewarding the genuine godliness of his people. If only the rest of the nation had demonstrated such covenant faithfulness at the same time. In this genealogy, the name of Boaz and Obed are indeed proclaimed far beyond Bethlehem and Israel to the ends of the earth. But the narrator could not know what implications the piety of these characters would have on generations of his own people that would come after him. If only he could have known that in the glorious providence of God, the Hesed of Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi would have laid the groundwork for the history of salvation that extends far beyond his own time and place. For as the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1 indicates, one greater than David comes from the loins of Boaz. In the dark days of the judges, the foundation is laid for the line that would produce the Savior, the Messiah, the Redeemer of a lost and destitute humanity. God was working this. Praise His name. Thank you.